はい、それでは最後のセッション、
This is session 4, the energy business transition. In the first 3 sessions, first of all, we looked at the global renewable situation. And session 2 and 3, we spoke about the green hydrogen and offshore wind. Session 4, once again, we return to a general, the transformation in the power business, but slightly strongly focused on Japan. And therefore, from Japan, we have 3 speakers, and Dolf Gielen of IRENA, who appeared in video, and he will join us online. Before the presentations, if I may, I also have a few slides to provide materials for discussion. So, transformation in the power business, in what way is it transforming? Lots of different definitions, but I have 2 perspectives. Number 1, the renewable also becoming the main core power, even in Japan. At REI, we were established in 2011. From the beginning, our goal was to make Japan a renewable energy-based society. METI and the Agency for Natural Resources, from about 2 years ago, they have also started to mention about renewable becoming the core energy, and we are approaching the stage of realizing that goal. As many have spoken, I will not repeat, but first of all, solar. Finally, in Japan, eventually it will become the cheapest source of power. Many organizations have made these projections. The graph indicates data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance as of last year. By 2050 in Japan, solar will also become the cheapest source of power in Japan. Large-scale offshore wind, also the development has started, as the latest session spoke about. The renewable in Japan, solar expanded rapidly, and Japan solar is at the 2nd or the 3rd largest across the world. But the 2 pillars, the solar and the wind, out of that, Japan was lagging behind in wind, which was the weak point. Finally, we are becoming larger in the wind. So 30 gigawatt, including both of offshore and the onshore, are in the pipeline. On the side of the users of the power, the users are starting to go renewable. On the 31st of January, we organized the RE Users Summit, and 20 leading companies got together, and by 2030, 44% or higher of the electricity should be based on renewable. So users have started to demand renewable-based electricity. So that is one meaning of transformation. And with this movement, it is now becoming a near reality for us to be based on renewable energy. Another point is about the crisis of the climate. Some of the international speakers referred to the IPCC report. In the discussion of the electricity policy in Japan, the reference to climate is not much discussed. That is the characteristic of debate here in Japan. So that is why I am mentioning this. So the second meaning of transformation is to deal with the climate crisis. The implementation of Paris Agreement has started, and the IPCC 1.5 degree special report by 2050, zero emission must be achieved. But in order to do that, by 2030, that the CO2 emission have to be halved. That also was the IPCC report message, and which means that by 2030, renewable has to grow to 50%. So, being aware of this matter, the Japanese electricity industry's future will have to be considered. And about Japan, as you know, by 2030, in terms of energy mix, renewable 22 to 24% is the target. And the nuclear 20 to 22%. So non-fossil or no carbon, 44% of the energy mix. As Mr. Kato mentioned in the earlier session, nuclear is not likely to reach 20%. So that deficiency, if nothing is done, the coal thermal could fill the gap. That is the concern. At the lower part of this page, the project of existing coal thermal, already before the 2011 March disaster, 44 gigawatt of coal thermal had existed, and on top of that, there are new build plans or increase. 21 giga has been announced for new or expansion, and out of that, 8 has been cancelled, but 11 gigawatt, the construction has started. If these are all completed, then 55 gigawatt of coal thermal will be added or expanded. If these start operation, then we shall be using even larger amount of coal thermal here in Japan. If this happens, the Paris Agreement commitment or the IPCC's recommendation, Japan will be completely deviating from the desirable direction. So how much can we expand the renewable? As of April last year, our institute announced the strategy towards decarbonization. By 2030, how much renewable can be supplied? This is our estimate, but this is a very approximate calculation. The Wind Association said by 36 gigawatt by 2030, and RTS have calculated that by 2030, 150 gigawatt of solar. When those two are added, what may happen? But roughly speaking, 40% can be supplied by renewable by 2030. In addition to that, if there are efforts to improve energy efficiency, then there will be close to 50% of our energy supplied by renewable. But this is a very approximate calculation, and therefore at our institute we are studying more in depth. By March and April we shall come up with a more detailed forecast. There is a possibility of achieving this, but lots of efforts are required. Today we have 4 experts. In order to realize this goal, what Japan has to do, we hope to have a clearer view at this moment, and therefore let me introduce the first speaker. So from Shizen, Mr. Ken Isono.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? I'm Representative Director of Shizen Energy, meaning natural energy. My name is Ken Isono. In the previous session, looking at the industry as a whole and the world trends have been shared. So I would like to first introduce our company to you, Shizen Energy. Specifically, how we have introduced renewables. That's what I would like to share with you. Very briefly, I would like to introduce our company. 2011, in June, we established this company. In the world, about 1 gigawatt renewables. Renewable sources are being developed. Our raison d'etre, or we just call it purpose. We take action for the blue planet. To achieve this, we do our work every day. PV accounts for the bulk, and the wind and the mini hydro and the biomass power plants are being developed in Japan. About 100 renewable power plants operated by our company. In overseas, we also have several projects ongoing. Recently, it's about to be completed, a wind farm in Vietnam. It's to be completed soon. Now, going forward, to increase renewables, we believe that there are two important aspects. One, global, and at the same time, local. Have a local perspective in advancing these projects. The essence of renewables, this is distributed energy. In the past, nuclear power generation, thermal power plant generation, compared with them, there are many small-scale power plants. I think that's the point of renewables. Many power plants. How quickly can we make those power plants? We need to learn best practice from the world, and also looking at the Japanese community, and for each country in the world, localize them and realize them. We believe that those are important aspects. So we want to gather people from the world, and then we are actually doing that in our company. From the perspective of local, distributed parcels, and when we have many power plants, what's important is to build consensus with the people in the local community. Can we share the same perspective? That's another important aspect. The climate action, environment issues, we are tackling those. So renewable energy is good, but we shouldn't just dwell on that. But are we actually helping the community to solve their own problems? One example, in Nagano Prefecture, in the town called Obuse, we have a micro hydropower plant. We're operating this power plant, and between the third sector, the cable television company, and the town, the three-party created the joint venture Nagano Denryoku, and we started doing this from November last year. So this is for the community. For major projects, when the revenues are significant, again, we look at what the problems are in the community. Farmers or the fishermen, people who are engaged in fishery, we again co-work with them to establish a project. How quickly can we introduce renewable energy? That's another important aspect. And we need many partners there, or various kinds of partners are necessary. As our capital partners, for instance, Tokyo Gas, and those who have world know-how. In 2013, UE is a German renewable company, and we established a joint venture with UE. In the last session, Allstate was represented here in Japan to do the offshore wind power generation. Canadian Northern Power, with them, we established a 50-50 joint venture to introduce world know-how to Japan. Conversely, when we go abroad, our local partners abroad are very important. So by working together with them, we don't wish to do everything by ourselves. We want to have partners to expand renewables. Here in Japan, what should be done? What should we do? From the REI, the institute shared with us the scenario, but our own scenario is closely resembling yours. 2035, achieving 50% renewables against the total energy. That's our scenario. How can we lower the cost, comparable to the marginal cost when the coal is used? How best we can achieve that? And then as a power source, renewable power source should expand, and then there might be a significant demand-supply adjustment required. To that end, I believe that there are three important points. First, facilities themselves, the prices of facilities or equipment themselves, the grid connection or the grid management cost, how to lower the grid management cost is another. Third, concerns land. How can we create the appropriate pieces of land in higher quantity? First, about the hardware type of aspect. Now, globally, there are best practices. We would like to introduce them here in Japan, and I think it's doable. As for the second perspective, I'm sorry to say it's rather difficult, even if we keep making efforts. But with regard to the third, having more appropriate pieces of land with the local governments and also with the central government, together with them, we can expand the areas, the appropriate areas for the renewables. For instance, look at PV, a flat piece of land without slopes. We have to find them, that's important, if it's the wind power generation. We need to have good wind conditions, but because of regulations, it's rather difficult for us to establish a windmill in such areas. That's something we are already seeing. And so for wind power generation, how can we expand the potential pieces of land to achieve the renewable energy 50% versus total energy? This is important. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I would like to pass the microphone to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Isono. Global and local was discussed. By 2035, 50% is the goal. Thank you very much from SoftBank Group. Representative Director CEO, SB Energy Corporation, Shigeki Miwa.
SB Energy Representative Director. My name is Shigeki Miwa. On SB Energy, in 2011, we established the company, and since then in Japan, in 50 locations, 800 megawatts of renewable energy, onshore wind power is something that we have a track record for. In Mongolia, 50 megawatts of wind power generation is what we're doing in one location. And our SB Energy's India local subsidiary is such that at present point, a 5 gigawatt pipeline exists, and of this, 1 gigawatt is in operation. So that's the present situation. The power business in transformation, that's the theme today, which has been given to me. I've thought about different things. And within the external changes in the environment, I'd like to talk about what we are thinking. And I believe that talking about this might prove helpful in the discussions. And that is the view with which I've put together this presentation. Let me start right away. On the institutional side, 2012, on the 1st of July, FIT for industry has been introduced. And since then, I believe there have been favorable results. But with the advancement of certain development, we believe that we need to review the institution, and we need to address the changes that are taking place. And so what we have in mind at present are that the entities that we sell to, there are PPAs for entities, corporations. This is something that we want to think about. Corporate PPA or industry PPA is sometimes the expression used, and that's one direction. And in designing the institutions, from doing this with help to going to do this on a completely commercial basis alone. And in terms of the industry, there are major flows, which is that large size concentration to long-term transmission to on-site distributed small-scale operations. And I think that's the major flow. It's not an either-or situation. The traditional grid, the central grid, in addition to that, on-site distribution would be increased, so increasing both. And we want to participate positively in these areas. And the other point is, maybe we could call this a key word, whether it's solar or wind, when it comes to renewable energy, the negative aspects was said to be stability. If that is the case, there are different solutions. We think one of this would be storage batteries. Battery storage is one of the solutions. The storage battery cost reduction is underway, and by combining this to make for a stable power source. And the other is AI and IoT, by combining AI technology so that the demand side and supply side could be controlled more through matching, for example, VPP, virtual power plants. A business model of VPP is something that we're pursuing as well. And this is an example from overseas. In the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, a 50 megawatt wind turbine has been put into operation. And we are quite proud of that. In Mongolia, in the local Gobi Desert, the local mining company, 500 megawatts. The first project was a 50 megawatts, a 10 times larger hybrid PV wind power supply is what we're considering. And on distributed power source, on the part of the SoftBank group, the blue energy, SOFC type, and fuel cells are what we're promoting as for fuel cells, using gas. That's city gas or town gas, CH4, to take out hydrogen from that, and through electric chemical reaction to generate power. Town gas, the middle pressure gas pipes will be used, so it's resilient against disasters. Existing infrastructure can be used, and there is no combustion burning process. CO2 emissions can be largely controlled, no NOx and SOx emissions. These are the merits. And in addition, it's a distributed system, and introduction can be done very quickly, and it's a clean power source. We often receive questions when it comes to fuel cells, CH4. When we use gas, people ask whether it's renewable energy, but we do use gas, and perhaps we shouldn't call it renewable energy, but it's a clean energy source. In the case where we use biogas, then in that case, we could claim it's renewable energy. And another direction which we're pursuing, there's a startup company called Exeger in Sweden. It's the ultimate distributed power source. That's a sheet-type photovoltaic cell. Even if it's a small, weak amount of light, power can be generated. Headphones, earphones, that can be powered without a power source going forward. the PV cell, which is attached onto the device, will constantly generate power. You don't need to recharge. So such solutions might be considered in the future. If you look at this slide, perhaps you'll be able to have an image of what I was talking about. And as for storage batteries, as I have said at the outset, storage battery prices are coming down. PV and wind and storage batteries can be combined to make for a stable power source for PV and wind. By doing this on a large scale, we'll introduce even more renewable energy. And this is another interesting entry point. There's a U.S. Boston startup company called Climacell that does weather forecasting, and we've made an investment in this company in terms of our thinking. Tomorrow's we're not thinking only in terms of tomorrow's weather. What's the temperature and humidity or weather 10 minutes from now? These are things that we want to think about. And by combining this technology and PV and wind, the supply side prediction and demand side prediction, if that can be done, then the matching can be improved within the power system. And this slide is about the virtual power plant. As I said at the outset, the SoftBank SB Energy, as an aggregator, will stand between the supply and demand to do the matching, and AI will be leveraged for this purpose. It's true to form of SoftBank in that if nationwide there are several 100,000 of mobile telephone towers, and there are batteries which can be combined to provide the different services, and these are the things that we'd like to think about going forward. All told, in terms of the direction to be pursued in the future, IoT and AI technology and battery technology, these are material which would create important changes. And this is the last page. And this is somewhat of an advertisement of our company. Renewable energy development and operation is something that we will be making utmost efforts toward the future. And what's renewable energy development and operation, and in addition to that, batteries, AI, and OT. We want to muster wisdom in this area. And so I have been very brief, but I'd like to conclude at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miwa. It's a very IT-based company. Thank you very much for telling us your effort. So we have heard from two enterprises, and next speaker from the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy, we have Mr. Shimizu, Director of New and Renewable Energy Division. As I mentioned, from around 2 years ago, the agency and METI have now started to talk and recommend making renewable as the core. So, Director of New and Renewable Energy Division.
As was introduced, I'm with the New and Renewable Energy Division from Agency for Natural Resources and Energy from METI. My name is Shimizu. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity. The moderator, Mr. Ohno, and Mr. Isono, and Mr. Miwa, as the Miwa mentioned, if you look at the environment surrounding renewables, there have been significant changes, making it the main source of energy. How can we make sure this is going to fly? In terms of policies, we have been coming up with creative ideas to do so. I would like to share with you what you find as some interesting. I would like to share with you the current renewable situation and the policy direction going forward. As for the materials or handout, there are English pages and Japanese pages. In principle, they are consistent, so please refer to whatever you are comfortable with. So first, about what's the current situation concerning the introduction of renewables? FIT 2012, the law was established, and implemented, and then renewables are on the increase, page 3 and page 4, as you can see on the graph. Having said that, in terms of power source, PV accounts for the bulk. Well, PV is increasing actually. As for the other renewable power sources, they still have some challenges before they enjoy significant increase. Page 5, please. You can see page 5 and page 6. Please look at the numbers. Energy mix 22 to 24%. That's the target. For the PV in 64 million to 64 gigawatts, that's the target. It's about 82%. That's the PV. If you look at the other power sources, they still have a long way to go. One major point in the major direction so far, FIT was the support mechanism to promote all those 5 power sources. For each power source, the issues of the future promises, cost reduction, direction, there are differences. So how can you come up with ideas to have more granularity in the institutional design? That's the major direction. In terms of that's for the introduced volume. Page 7 and page 8, as you can see, the renewable energy cost. As was already mentioned, you can see that they enjoyed significant decrease. Having come to grid parity in the other parts of the world, it's lower than that. And here in Japan, it's right on the track to achieve grid parity, lowering the renewables cost. How can we accelerate and making it main power source and introduce a mass introduction of conduct mass introduction of renewables without the burden on the people? The burden on the people to introduce renewables, that's the possible burden on the people. That's one issue. Page 9 and page 10. I would like to skip the details, but in terms of the slope or the gradient, that you can see the red arrow and the red dot since the implementation of the FIT law and so far. You can see that there has been significant increase as the burden on the people. As for the energy mix target, to achieve the energy mix target, we need to make the slope much milder so that people won't be overburdened. And if we try to achieve higher introduction, that means how can we accelerate the cost reduction? Our understanding is that's the biggest issue. Page 11, please. Overall, direction of what we are studying at the moment. First, as I said, depending on the characteristic of each power source, we should look at more detailed designing of the institution and how best we can lower the cost. Second, we need to have the appropriate business discipline for offshore and PV. I would like to come back to this later about the discipline. And the grid constraints, how best we can conquer them, overcome them. That's the third issue. We need to come up with appropriate policies. And how can we pave a way for mass introduction? I think that's the government, the major theme. Page 13. First, about the cost. The first issue. And page 14, FIT tariffs. So since 2012, it has come down significantly. On the other hand, compared with the international level, it's still high. 10 yen compared with the wholesale price, it's still high. It's expensive. How can we address this? That's another issue. So the direction for each power source, page 15, so that we can introduce more to make it power source. That is the main power source, and that's competitive. The large-scale PV and wind power generation, that's important. But reducing cost, how can we foster the cost reduction, but at the same time introduce them in a mass scale, at the mass introduction, just like FIT. If it's disconnected from the market, then it will have a burden on the grid. So feed-in premium coupled with the market, introducing such a mechanism that is coupled with the market and making it more ordinary parcels to achieve the mass introduction as competitive parcels, as shown on the left. On the right-hand side, it says locally utilized renewable sources. It's difficult to achieve the mass introduction, and at the moment, the cost reduction is rather moderate. To what extent we should support them? I understand there are a lot of discussions behind the meter parcels in local communities for locally produced, locally consumed parcels. The resilience, so that they can take their root in the local community, and that's important. So for each parcel, we need to pave the pathway. Second, for each parcel, improving the business environment, page 18 and onwards. As Mr. Ohno mentioned, offshore wind power generation from the global perspective and also from the Japan's potential, we believe that has a significant potential to have the mass introduction and lowering the cost. The law was amended last year, and we are focusing on promoting offshore wind. Page 20, page 21, with the zoning, one by one. By designating the area, we are promoting the offshore wind. To be honest with you, it's all predicated on the consensus understanding from the local community. It's unprecedented. We really have to work closely with the local residents, how best we can create success cases, so that here in Japan, as an energy policy, it has to be significant. Also, as an economic policy, it has to be meaningful. If people understand that, then there's a potential that this is going to enjoy a rapid expansion. How best we can create those success cases at the same time for each locality, because this is not the easy thing. It has to be well planned based on laws and regulations, and that's what we have been doing. Offshore wind power generation will play an important key role. Page 24 and otherwise, the waste and disposal. As for the PV, I think it was already mentioned, as Mr. Isono mentioned, how can we garner the understanding from the local community? Even there is the potential from the sun. There's a limited place to introduce PV. How can we get more understanding from people, the safety disciplines, and also the disposal of the used panels? There has to be symbiosis, including the rooftop and local production, local consumption. We will need to garner all the strength from all over Japan to secure places where we can install the solar equipment. That's one big issue. We need to deepen the understanding from the local communities. So improving the business environment, how are we going to go about it, especially for PV and offshore wind? For the fundamental expansion, we believe that this is another important aspect. Third point, this concerns grid. Page 26, as you can see, cannot be connected, it's slow and it's expensive. Utilizing the existing grid, the Japan version of Connect and Manage, how can we review the grid rules and introduce renewables? Also in a planned manner, how we go about the improvement of the grids? We believe that's the third major issue. It has been a rather sketchy explanation, but reducing cost and looking at the characteristic of each parcels, how are we going to design the institutions, especially for offshore wind and PV? We need to work together with the local communities so that we can introduce them in a planned manner. How can we improve the environment? Third, grid improvement, especially for mass introduction of renewables. These constitute major issues. In the latter half of February, the revision concerning the bill of the revising FIT, it was passed in the cabinet, and deliberation in the parliament will follow. At the same time, what we can do at the moment, we would like to make sure we do a good job to introduce them in a massive manner, and also lowering the cost on the part of the people. We would like to pave a way to achieve those. I'm pretty sure there are many more issues, but in the following discussions, I would like to deepen those points. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimizu. Indeed, solar has been developed, offshore wind starting, and indeed, renewable is becoming our major source of energy. Sort of fine-tuning of our system and institutions are now required to integrate a large amount of variable renewable. As Mr. Shimizu mentioned, integration into the grid is the major challenge. There is abundant international expertise. Last but not least, in Germany, Dolf Gielen of IRENA, he will now join us live. It's very early in your place. Thank you very much. The floor or the webcast is yours.
Thank you very much, Ohno-san. Minasama konnichiwa. It's a great pleasure to join you today and to add to this important discussion about how to integrate high shares of variable renewables. We see that this is a global trend, which is very much driven by the favorable economics for solar PV and wind, and also by the need for mitigating CO2 emissions. Now, if you look at the global situation today, so there is around 10% variable renewables in the generation mix, but we think that that share will rise very significantly in the coming decades, and we think that the total share for the world can rise up to 60% by 2050. So power systems dominated by variable renewables. And as was mentioned by the earlier speakers, of course, this creates special challenges for how do you operate such grids. Fortunately, there is already a lot of experience in this area. So I'm located in Germany, and to give you a few numbers for the German case, so last month in February, the share of renewables in the generation mix in Germany was nearly 64%. So it is already a situation which is at these high levels of variable renewables. And of course, that was a month. But if you look at the data for 2019, so there were around 23% of wind and around 9% of solar in the generation mix, so a total of nearly 33%. So it shows you, it's an example of a large economy running increasingly on variable renewables, and it shows that it is technically feasible to operate such systems. And of course, we have also examples of other smaller countries, for example, Denmark, which have even higher shares. So this is possible, but what we need is more flexibility. Flexibility is the key solution to integrating high shares of variable renewables. And there are many ways to achieve that flexibility, and we have done in-depth studies during the past 2 years. What are the different strategies that can be applied to obtain that flexibility? And I'll try to elaborate that a bit. So the traditional model is, you can see on the left here, it was that the flexibility came from dispatchable fossil fuel plants, so especially natural gas and to a lesser extent also coal-based power generation that could be switched on and off. That demand side, that supply side flexibility is still very important. It can come from fossil fuel plant, it's more challenging for nuclear plant. The whole concept of base load has to go. What we need is dispatchability, not base load. There are, of course, a number of options to achieve that. There's also variable, let's say, renewable generation options to achieve that. For example, biogas plant can be dispatchable, and also hydro, of course, hydropower is an important form of dispatchable power. But that alone is not enough. We also need to look for more flexibility from better integration of grids. So interconnectors become very important. So let's say within a country, of course, in the Japanese case, but in other cases also international connections. And what is also even more important is the flexibility on the demand side. So that is what is called distributed energy resources. So, for example, batteries were already mentioned by earlier speakers, but smart charging, smart cooling, electrolyzers for hydrogen production, and demand side response and demand side management are all in that category. And so we will need all these different forms of flexibility. This is helped by three important trends that we see now in power systems. So on one hand, more decentralized generation. Rooftop PV is the typical example. Then on the second aspect is the electrification of end users. So for example, electromobility, if we combine that with smart charging, it can introduce important new flexibility on the demand side. And then digitalization is very important and critical to achieve that demand side flexibility and to get to these smarter power systems. So you need a lot more information exchange, you need a lot more communication between the supply side, the demand side, and the system operators to actually activate this flexibility. We divided the sources of flexibility into 4 dimensions. So, of course, technology is very important, but also the systems operation, the market design and regulation, and the business models can be sources of flexibility. And we did an in-depth study. We looked at a few hundred cases from around the world of how flexibility is being introduced. We've issued a report on that called Innovation Landscape for a Renewable Powered Future. And we found 30 categories of innovations. So across these 4 dimensions of technologies, business models, market design, and system operation. And for these 30 categories, we have characterized them and we have described what is the best practice around the world and how could you apply that. And there are individual innovation briefs available for all these sources of flexibility, and you can find them on our website. This is very much intended as a toolbox. So what we're doing now is that we travel to countries and we have what we call innovation days, where we discuss which of these 30 innovations are now applicable in your specific national situation, because of course you have to take into account the specifics of the national power systems. But generally speaking, we find that, of course, technology is very important. On the demand side, let's say the pricing for the consumers should reflect scarcity. That is very important. source of flexibility. And then through new digital solutions, so virtual power plants, etc., were already mentioned, you can also introduce very interesting new solutions for flexibility. Also, we find that it's generally not one single of these 30 innovations that provides the flexibility. Usually you need to combine more dimensions than one to get to a solution that is widely applicable. And we have characterized 11 key solutions that combine different elements, different innovations to provide the necessary flexibility. Now, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. As I said, I mean, you need to look into the specifics of the power systems. Here, we try to characterize different innovations for flexibility along two axes. One is the potential, the quantitative potential for flexibility. Another one is the cost. So ideally, you want, of course, an option with a high potential and low cost. As you see in this arrangement, such option does not exist. There is a trade-off between the potential and the cost. And also, this is only, let's say, one dimension for decision-making. Of course, the ease of implementation is another important dimension we also try to characterize. And so you need to look into the specifics of the country, and based on that, pick the solutions that are readily, that are best suited for the national conditions. Batteries were mentioned already a couple of times. We get a lot of questions of countries. So if we start to introduce solar and wind, do we need then also to invest in batteries? Our standard reply is that batteries can be an important source of flexibility, but it's really important to look at the full suite of flexibility options and pick the ones that fit best your national conditions, and do not immediately go for single solutions. And in practice, you will see that usually a mix of solutions is the best. We are confident that it is possible to operate power systems with high shares of variable renewables based on the practice we see today. We also think that the cost of this grid integration are not very significant, and therefore we think that we can, with confidence, head for a future with high shares of renewables. That concludes my remarks. Maybe a final comment that all of this will also be discussed in greater detail at our upcoming Innovation Week in September here in Germany. And of course, you're all very welcome. That concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dolf. Japan will be heading to a large integration of a variable renewable, and everything is possible. Thank you very much for the encouraging message. We only have some 15 minutes or so for discussion, but this is a precious opportunity. So indeed, we would like to have a little time of discussion. Mr. Isono, Mr. Miwa, both of the companies are active globally. I would like to ask you, you do business both in and outside the country, and based on your experience outside of Japan, do you have any ideas about what is lacking here in Japan? Isono-san, Miwa-san, in that order, any suggestions?
Well, based on our experience, Japan is not really at that disadvantage. Each country has its own issues. Now, speaking of Japan, there are many things actually, but there are many local rules in Japan. In introducing certain facilities or equipment, there are local rules And the global manufacturers are expected to satisfy those local rules. We often experience that. So if they become global standards, that would actually help lower the cost.
Yes, there are different points. For one thing, power procurement must be thought of as a management issue. The management has to perceive it as such, and it'll become more important to do so. At the present point in time, the United States or Europe, they'll be looking at their own company and their own plants. What kind of power are they procuring? In what ways? There is that awareness. When that is enhanced, what I want to say is, on the demand side, the demand side has the ability to change the supply side. It has the potential. And what's happening in Europe and the United States boils down to that. You can say, oh, this is the kind of power that we've decided to buy. And when that development broadens, that could become a huge power. For example, if on site you want a distributed type of power source which is strengthened, and they want lower insurance premiums for that, and that might be a need on the part of the demand. SCC 7, that this could be what this is called, more cleaner power to permeate. So the company's power source, what are they procuring and in what way are they procuring? The demand side, the Japanese businesses and individuals and business managers must give more thought to this. And that could give rise to a groundswell of movements. Looking at the situation overseas, this is a point which I really think about.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shimizu. You yourself, in terms of institution building, what improvement might be required, you are responsible for that, and also for the business. If you have any wishes about what you would like to see in terms of changes here in Japan for the real renewable energy business, what is your request over the Japanese industry?
I see. Thank you for your question. It's a difficult issue because there are so many things I want to discuss and time is limited. So in that sense, in the case of Japan, 2012 FIT started. So new businesses, I think, started from 2012. I think that's been significant. And so far, predicated on FIT, business models have been developed. And as Mr. Miwa mentioned, selling directly to users under the FIT, such idea was not really fostered or developed. How are you become conscious of the environmental values using a battery, for instance? How to sell the electricity when the prices are higher? So under the current FIT, whatever is produced was purchased by the government. And that was the business. That's the basic business model for the past 7 or 8 years. And now from FIT to FIP, feeding premium, and then graduating from the FIP. As a normal business, what kind of electricity does the consumer want when you want to sell it at the higher prices? What can you do? Including your companies, I think you are coming up with really advanced models for instance, graduating from FIT for households. Some pioneering companies are studying all this. So there's a momentum in the business. I would like to see the acceleration, expansion of the momentum. And as the government, how can we help them? That's an important aspect.
Thank you, Dolf, also. Within the IRENA activities, you have visibility across the world. And about Japan's renewable policy, you do have knowledge. And based on that, Dolf, from your perspective, in order to expand renewable in Japan, what has to be done? if you have any observations.
Well, I think that the more flexible use of the interconnectors, which has started, I think is a very important part of the solution in Japan. Another part is what I mentioned, that more demand-side flexibility can be very helpful, and for that you need prices that reflect scarcity. So that's something that also deserves more attention. And then as we're moving into more electromobility, then smart charging becomes very important, and that's especially in a Japanese context where solar plays such an important role. You need to make sure that these cars are being charged then during the day when there is a surplus availability of solar electricity. And also the high share of cooling in Japan can represent an important flexibility potential. So all of that, the demand side deserves more attention.
Thank you very much. The interconnector. There are 10 monopolies looking at the regional areas, but we have to think in a nationwide time and also the importance of the demand side. Thank you very much. I have a question to Shimizu-san. In the earlier part, the businesses in the renewable industry, that the government should have a fixed target at the central government level. This is often mentioned. Mr. Shimizu, you should be aware about this request. I also say that 22 to 24%, that is not the cap. We can go beyond that. I often explain, so that is not the cap, and we can do as much as we want about the renewable. We understand, but on the side of the government, could you not come up with an ambitious target? Otherwise, the enterprises cannot be assured in terms of business environment. So 22 or 24, and not say you can go beyond. But why does the central government not come up with an even more ambitious goal, more than 22 or 24? Reaction, please.
Mr. Ohno, you actually gave us the answer before I actually said it, so making my task very difficult. By power source, I think it differs. It differs by power source. In the last session, I was here. For instance, in the case of offshore wind, the supply chain of business has not been established, and in terms of investment decisions, how it's going to actually penetrate, that's another aspect. We don't know how it's going to be held, and to be honest with you, I can't make a significant commitment here in this place. So as the government, what kind of a pace, with what kind of pace, how are we going to designate those areas or the zones? That will be significant, meaningful, and we don't want to just have a pie in the air. Unfortunately, there's a grid issue, and we also need to have understanding from the local residents. There are social constraints, and there are other types of constraints. We need to dissolve all those problems, and then one way or another, we would like to come up with a target. We share that. On the other hand, concerning other power sources, for instance, in the case of photovoltaic PV, going beyond the national targets, while the cost has been reducing as a kind of a self-sustaining business, I think they're already in the phase of enjoying self-sustaining one. The geothermal and for hydropower, the early developmental risks. How can we liberate companies from them, or how the ministries and agencies should assume those risks? But on our part, we can't really see the level of those risks. And just would it be really effective to just announce those targets? I have a question mark. We need to look at the issues by power source, and as the government, if our target means so much for the investors investment decisions, we would like to think it. I think I really did dare. I gave you a daring the answer.
So next year there will be a revision of the basic plan. We look forward to a very ambitious plan that even surprises ourselves. So just one final remark to the role of the renewable towards decarbonization. Just one concluding remarks, please, Isono-san.
It's a raison d'être. What's important is, as you mentioned, there are various frameworks and there are hardware-related costs. I think the conditions have improved. So the rest is how quickly can we do this? How quickly can we achieve this? That's important. When our company was established, don't blame others. That's the important part of our culture. Don't blame others. Creating big projects. How can we get consensus understanding from the local communities how to lower the cost, including all those issues, go the distance. Each person has to play his or her role, take actions.
Miwa-san, please. We're SoftBank, so Asian supergrid is the word I want to end with. Broad area integration is made possible, and globally it's possible, Northeast Asia, to conduct a broad-scale integration, and by so doing, introducing RE. There are various challenges. To do very stable studies is very important in that regard.
Shimizu-san. Looking at energy policies as a whole, there are various points, there are various issues. And it would be difficult just to say a general answer, but no matter how you look at it, introducing renewable energy is a must, 2050 and going beyond that. Creating a society as soon as possible where the renewables can be introduced in a significant manner. I think anybody from any perspective would agree to that. So creating such a society, we would like to assume our responsibility. We would like to do our own bit. And two speakers gave us a very encouraging stories. And we need the business momentum. Otherwise, we can't really achieve that kind of a society. Public and private sectors working together, we should collaborate with each other. That's important.
Finally, Dolf, your final comments, like a request to Japan?
Well, we are confident that on the power generation side, we will rapidly move to higher shares of renewables. That's a global trend, and probably we'll also see that in Japan. And there's clearly now a shift in attention also towards more sector coupling, so using these amounts of renewable electricity to also clean up the buildings, industry, and transport sectors. That's where the global attention is shifting, and we are looking forward to see the same trends in Japan.
Thank you very much. So mainly we spoke about electricity, but as Dolf mentioned, we have to look at all other sectors, heat or other areas. It should be 100 all from a renewable source. And I am sure that this session has been useful for that aspect. I would like to thank all the members for joining us from Germany from the very early hour. Thank you very much. We will conclude this session.
So, welcome to this session after a long day. I would like to start by thanking everyone involved in this improvised webcast arrangement with short notice. It seems as if we have managed with all the technical facilities to distribute the ideas and descriptions and data and statistics and all the PowerPoint slides from this event to a lot of people all around, not only Japan, but also other parts of Asia, apparently from the feedback that we have already received. So thanks to everyone involved, to the interpreters and all the technical staff here that has made this possible. and not least to all the speakers who have contributed. But let us try to see what are the essence of what we have read. Seiyuu-san, you've been listening most of the day. Can you
first of all, let me echo what you said. I join you in thanking to all of them.
In the past 20 years, through my background, that is finance, I've been looking at the responses to climate change. Recently, these are things that I feel new. That is most recently in the past year, or maybe even in the past 6 months, the world's response is quickly changing. And that is what I'm feeling. And this rapid change, if I were to use one word to describe that, that would be the zero-emission era has formally and on a full scale opened and begun. And my thinking is that Japan, in the flow of zero emission, which just started in the world, has fallen largely behind. Maybe it has missed the bus. That's my concern. And the reason I think this, I'd like to state several examples. As you know, the world, European advanced countries, on a national level, zero emission has been introduced as a formal policy. UK, France, EU, Germany, and so forth. And in the business world, full-scale responses have begun. Most recently, last year in September, what surprised the world, Amazon's zero emission. And this year, Microsoft is talking about carbon negative to not only reduce to zero, but to go into negative territory. They have gone that far. And what I'm deeply interested in that is finance. The conservative traditional financial institutions coming on board. In New York, BlackRock, the world's largest management company, has 800 trillion yen under management, and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan likewise. These are private sector financial institutions, but not only that, the world's financial institutions, the very center of the system is moving. Bank of England in the UK is one case in point. Or EIB, European Investment Bank, is another example. Or ECB, European Central Bank, is beginning to lean toward green finance. BIS, the gathering of world central banks, is using Lisa 1, the climate change and the crisis is what they're issuing a warning against. And what we should not forget is Greta Thunberg's and the young people having new values and trying to change the social society and consumption and the economy. Within this change, how do we view Japan's energy policy? Of course, energy, it's important to discuss energy from the energy perspective, but the economy and the society needs the energy, and the economy and the society accepts this energy, and all of this has to go well, and the society surrounding energy is largely undergoing changes, and we have to think about our energy policy as it ought to be going forward. And it's very important to think about it. Yesterday we had the experts meeting, and today we had a whole day of meeting. What I'm keenly aware of is that all of the numbers are there. And it's very clear that we have to do this. And if I may point out, in Japan, whether it's technology or whether it's demand and whether it's the industry, they have been fostered, and the consumers are asking for it. The businesses are asking for it. So all the elements are there. And what is important for Japan, the good practice is now in Europe and in the West are emerging one after another. If there's something lacking in Japan, what is it? That is, in my view, policy and a central government leadership. That is lacking. And without this leadership, Well, if there is no leadership, we can still undergo changes. But the world is changing at a great speed, and they're upgrading their level. A central government with a lack of leadership from there, can we keep up with the speed of change in the world? When I think about this, I am gravely concerned.
I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, as I mentioned before, and you come to Japan often, and you know Japan very well. How can we, tear down the wall which divides, private sector and national policy?
Well, I think I have begun to understand a lot about the Japanese energy system, and I see a lot of the industry, but I still do not understand the political decision making. So I leave that question back to you. At the same time, though, I think you may be a bit pessimistic, because what I have seen in the recent couple of years is that the electricity consuming part of industry has realized what is going on in the rest of the world. So there is a customer demand on the energy supply part of industry to change. And we also see a change in the financial sector in Japan, also now being more restrictive toward fossil fuels investment. And maybe even more important, the technology providing part of industry is also beginning to realize what is demanded in the rest of the world. Yes. So I think we are in a situation now where a large part of the Japanese industry has sort of shifted. So we need the energy companies, we need the government policies to adjust. But I think that the movement is going in the right direction here too.
Of course, I want to be too, pessimistic. But, Japan is number 3 in terms of GDP, and maybe number 2 in terms of financial capability. Such a big country cannot be just a follower of what's happening out of Japan. We need to be one of the leading group.
Yes.
My concern comes from that point of view.
And I hope that we have contributed with this day, that a lot of people in Japan have heard from our guests and speakers here, who heard about experience from the international experts, but also from the Japanese industry representatives here in the room, that there is now a strong urge to speed up development in the world as a whole, but in particular in Japan. And if you go back a few years, it was a battle between, on the one hand, saving the world, and on the other hand, making money. And as we've heard several times during today's deliberations, we now have a situation where the industrial development has gone so far that the saving the world efforts are also profitable.
Yes.
We heard it very clearly from Thierry Lepec, for example, that this is a matter now of being able to make money and save the world. And then the opposite is terribly embarrassing. So I think that we will see an accelerated development, and I'm quite sure it will change in Japan as well. The question is how slow it will be. And as you say, if you have been economically successful and you fail to change fast enough, you will lose. And that loss can be very expensive for an industrial country like Japan. So I do agree, it's urgent, but I have hope it will happen here too.
I do agree with you when you say that decarbonization should be profitable, otherwise it's sustainable. But in order to be, profitable and sustainable, the whole society should be changed, move into the same direction under the strong leadership of central government. Right,
and there is an important aspect of that, and that is that if we look at the rest of the world, we're now in a situation where what I said is generally true. It's profitable to do the right thing. It's profitable to reduce fossil fuel use. We see those who have invested in recent years in fossil fuels have lost a lot of money. We see bankruptcies in the US and other places. Japan is not quite there. And a lot of these differences are due to regulations that makes renewable energy more difficult in Japan than it has to be. And that's a very important part for the ministries and the policymakers to change, because if you fail...
As you often say, small is big. No. simple is beautiful.
Simple is beautiful, and that is very important when it comes to regulation, and especially the electricity market regulation in Japan is now so complicated that there are very few people who actually understand how it works. When we did the electricity market reform in Sweden almost 25 years ago now, the most important principle was to keep it simple. Because if we did not keep it simple, it would not be understood. And when it's not understood, those who are to take decisions will not take the right decisions. And by making it simple, it's also more predictable. People feel more confident. They don't see risks and uncertainties in the same way, which means that the cost of capital and therefore the cost of the electricity will be lower. So this is a very important thing that ought to be improved in Japan. It must be made simple enough for people to understand it.
As you know well, my background is finance, so that I want to know what's happening in Europe in terms of finance or financial change.
Yeah.
As I told you before, EIB, European Investment Bank, announced that they would stop financing to even natural gas after 2021. That is a big change. Here in Japan, coal might be, target for, stop financing, but EIB says that even natural gas. Yes.
And the
this
reason
is a big change about atmosphere among financiers.
And you have the two reasons again. You have those that want to show that they're doing it to save the world, and you have those who understand they do it to save their assets. And the latter is going to be extremely important. And we have seen now a year when renewables in electricity grew faster than the total growth in electricity generation. We are likely now, because of the coronavirus and so on, to have a bit of a recession this year, which means that demand for energy will likely decrease. Renewables will continue to increase anyway, and the result will be lower income for those who have the fossil assets. So we will likely see quite a bit of economic difficulties in the fossil energy industry this year, a lot of lost values. So it's very clever of people who have stepped out of that sector.
So when we talk about coal, we need to understand such a big change in Europe.
Yes,
otherwise
definitely.
We cannot make a correct answer.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, I think that we are about to run out of time. So again, I think we can jointly say thank you to all the people who have been involved in making this day, if not as successful as with a real conference with 1,000 participants, but at least very successful given the situation that we are in. And to all of you who have watched this day, we hope that we will be able to invite you to a real revision conference, maybe this autumn, when the risk of getting infected by virus is no longer there, and we can present even more progress in renewable energy, and even more interesting speakers can talk to you, and you can meet the speakers, and you can talk to each other. So again, thank you all. Thank you for your contribution, and let's hope that the future will be as positive as we have heard opportunities described today. Thank you all.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you to all.